No one allowed the ugly alien woman to sit next to them, but a human sat with her without saying anything. The celestial drift hummed with the steady thrum of quantum engines, a sound that had become as familiar as breathing to its 3,000 passengers. In the main cafeteria, holographic fish swam lazily across the transparent aluminum walls while the artificial gravity generators kept everyone's feet planted firmly on the deck plating. The smell of synthesized proteins and recycled air filled the vast space, punctuated by the occasional hiss of atmospheric processors working overtime. Elora sat at table 47, the same table she'd occupied for the past 18 days of their journey. Her elongated ears twitched slightly as conversations died around her, replaced by the familiar symphony of whispered comments and hastily averted gazes. The violet undertones of her skin seemed more pronounced under the cafeteria's harsh lighting, and the network of scars across the left side of her face caught shadows that made other passengers uncomfortable. "I heard she's from that planet that got hit by the solar flares," someone muttered from 3 tables away. "They say the radiation did things to them." "Explains the smell," another voice added, though Elora knew perfectly well that her people's natural pheromones were actually quite pleasant. Humans just seemed determined to find fault with everything about Zephyrians. A serving drone approached her table, its optical sensors flickering erratically. "Meal. Selection. Error. Error," it announced in its tinny voice before spinning in a confused circle and bumping into a nearby chair. "Oh, brilliant," Elora muttered under her breath. "Even the robots are prejudiced now." A young human boy at a nearby table pointed at her ears and whispered loudly to his mother, "Why are hers so pointy, Mom?" "Shush, Tommy," his mother hissed, pulling him closer. "Don't stare at her." Elora suppressed a smile. At least the child's curiosity was honest. She wiggled her ears slightly, just enough for the boy to notice, and watched his eyes widen with delight before his mother dragged him away with an expression of pure horror. The serving drone finally managed to deliver her meal, a gray protein paste that supposedly contained all necessary nutrients, and promptly malfunctioned again, this time playing a distorted version of an old Earth lullaby at maximum volume before shutting down entirely. "Great," someone complained from across the room. "Now the machinery's breaking down around her too." Elora poked at her meal with the provided utensil, a device that looked like it had been designed by committee and approved by no one. The paste had the consistency of wet cement and probably tasted worse, but it was food, and food was survival. She'd learned that lesson well enough during the evacuation of Zephyr Prime. "Attention passengers," the ship's AI announced through hidden speakers, its voice carrying that particular brand of artificial cheerfulness that made everyone want to punch something. "Due to minor fluctuations in the artificial gravity grid, please remain seated during your meal period. We apologize for any inconvenience and remind you that motion sickness medication is available at all medical stations." Right on cue, the gravity flickered, causing drinks to float momentarily before crashing back down onto tables. A woman 2 seats over immediately looked at Elora with suspicion, as if her mere presence had somehow caused the malfunction. Elora sighed and continued eating her tasteless meal, her elongated ears picking up fragments of conversations from around the cafeteria. Most of it was the usual passenger complaints. The food was terrible, the quarters were too small, the entertainment systems were outdated. But increasingly, her name seemed to work its way into these discussions, always accompanied by creative theories about her supposed influence on the ship's systems. "I'm telling you, Harold, ever since she came aboard, we've had nothing but problems," an elderly woman was saying to her companion. "First the replicators in Section C started producing blue food, then the gravity went wonky, and yesterday my cabin door got stuck for 3 hours." "Correlation doesn't imply causation, Martha," Harold replied with the weary tone of someone who'd had this conversation before. "The ship's been having technical difficulties for months. Remember when the holodeck created that army of dancing lobsters? That was different. That was just a software glitch." Elora almost choked on her protein paste, trying not to laugh. She remembered the dancing lobster incident. Half the ship had gathered to watch the spectacle, and it had provided entertainment for weeks afterward. Somehow, though, mechanical failures were only considered supernatural when she was around. A maintenance technician approached her table, looking uncomfortable. "Excuse me, miss, but I need to check the environmental controls near your seating area. We've been having some irregularities." "Of course you have," Elora replied pleasantly. Would you like me to move so you can properly blame the equipment failure on lingering alien energy signatures? The technician's face reddened. That's not... it's just standard procedure. I'm sure it is. She gestured to the empty chairs around her table. Please, feel free to scan away. I promise not to emit any mysterious radiations while you work. As the technician fumbled with his diagnostic equipment, Elora caught sight of a young human officer observing the interaction from across the room. Unlike the others, he wasn't staring at her scars or her ears with disgust or fascination. Instead, there was something analytical in his gaze, as if he was trying to solve a particularly interesting puzzle. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, neither looked away. Cale Morrison had seen stranger things than a Zephyrian woman eating alone in a cafeteria, but apparently, his fellow passengers hadn't. He watched from his position near the quantum coffee dispenser as another group of travelers deliberately chose seats on the opposite side of the room, whispering among themselves like school children sharing forbidden secrets. Engineering Officer Morrison to bridge, his comm unit crackled to life, interrupting his observations. We need you in Section 7. The atmospheric recyclers are acting up again. On my way, he replied, though he lingered for another moment, watching as the Zephyrian woman, Elora, according to the passenger manifest he'd accessed earlier, calmly endured another round of suspicious glances. The corridor to Section 7 was filled with the usual mix of passengers and crew, but today everyone seemed more agitated than usual. A group of Centaurian merchants were complaining loudly about their cargo hold's temperature fluctuations, while a family of human colonists insisted that their children's toys had started moving by themselves during the night. It's that alien woman, one of them was saying as Cale passed. Ever since she came aboard, strange things keep happening. My daughter's stuffed quantum bear started reciting poetry in ancient Martian last night. Cale paused. Are you sure it wasn't just the educational subroutines activating? Those toys are programmed with thousands of cultural databases. The woman looked at him suspiciously. You're defending her? I'm defending logic, Cale replied. Stuffed animals don't usually respond to alien presence, but they do respond to electromagnetic interference from aging wiring systems. He continued toward Section 7 before the conversation could escalate, shaking his head at the absurdity of it all. In his 3 years aboard various starships, he'd learned that passengers would blame anything unusual on the most convenient scapegoat, whether it was solar flares, quantum anomalies, or apparently, scarred alien women with pointy ears. The atmospheric recycler in Section 7 was indeed malfunctioning, but not in any way that suggested supernatural intervention. The filters were clogged with lint from the laundry systems, and one of the circulation fans had been installed backwards by a maintenance crew 2 weeks ago. Cale spent 20 minutes fixing problems that had nothing to do with alien curses and everything to do with human incompetence. There, he announced to Chief Engineer Valdez, who'd been nervously monitoring the work. Should run smoothly now. Though I'd recommend actually reading the installation manual next time we replace components. Valdez grunted. You think all these system failures are just coincidence? I think this ship is 40 years old and held together by spare parts and wishful thinking, Cale replied. The fact that everything hasn't broken down simultaneously is the real miracle. But the timing. Chief, yesterday you blamed the food replicator problems on Mercury being in retrograde. Last week it was cosmic radiation from a nearby pulsar. Now it's an alien passenger who's been nothing but polite to everyone, even when they're openly hostile to her. She makes people uncomfortable. So do half the passengers. That doesn't mean they're sabotaging our life support systems with their thoughts. Cale left Section 7 and headed back toward the main levels, but instead of returning to his quarters, he found himself walking toward the observation deck. The transparent aluminum dome offered a spectacular view of the star field they were traveling through, and more importantly, it was usually empty during the dinner shift. Today, however, someone else had the same idea. Elora stood near the central viewing platform, her silhouette outlined against the cosmic backdrop. Her elongated ears were slightly drooped, giving her an expression of melancholy that somehow made her scars seem less prominent and more like battle honors earned through survival. Beautiful, isn't it? She said without turning around, apparently having sensed his approach. The view. Yes. The company in the cafeteria. Less so. She turned to face him, and he noticed her eyes held flecks of silver that seemed to catch the starlight. You're the engineering officer who was watching me earlier. Guilty. Though I was actually watching the social dynamics. It's fascinating how quickly a group can designate a scapegoat for their problems. Fascinating is one word for it. She gestured toward the stars. You know, my people used to believe that every star held a story, and that travelers could read their futures in the patterns of light. And what do the stars tell you about your future aboard the celestial drift? That I should invest in better luck, she replied with a wry smile. The constellation directly ahead appears to be shaped like a maintenance drone having an existential crisis. Cale looked where she was pointing and laughed. You're right. Though I think that one over there looks like Chief Valdez trying to figure out which end of a wrench to hold. You're terrible, Elora said, but her smile widened. Though accurate. I watched him try to fix a wall panel yesterday. He spent 10 minutes looking for the on switch on a manual door. In his defense, most of the doors on this ship are automatic. Finding a manual one is like discovering an ancient artifact. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the stars wheel slowly past as the ship continued its journey through space. The observation deck's environmental systems hummed quietly around them, a sound that seemed almost musical compared to the harsh noise of the main corridors. Can I ask you something? Cale said finally. You can ask. I might not answer. Why don't you eat in the smaller dining areas? The officers' mess is accessible to all passengers with premium tickets, and it's usually less crowded with opinions. Elora's ears twitched slightly. Because hiding from prejudice doesn't make it go away. It just makes it easier to ignore until it becomes a bigger problem. That's very philosophical for someone eating synthesized protein paste. The paste builds character. Or at least it builds tolerance for terrible food, which amounts to the same thing in space travel. A soft chime echoed through the observation deck, followed by the ship's AI making another announcement. Attention passengers. Due to a minor malfunction in the holographic entertainment system, tonight's scheduled performance of Romeo and Juliet in 0G has been replaced with Hamlet versus the Space Pirates. We apologize for any inconvenience and remind you that refunds are not available for acts of God, quantum fluctuations, or dramatic substitutions. Well, Elora said, at least Hamlet versus Space Pirates sounds more entertaining than floating Shakespearean tragedy. You're assuming the malfunction wasn't intentional, Cale replied. I helped install that system. Sometimes it gets bored and decides to improvise. A bored AI running entertainment systems. What could possibly go wrong? Last month it decided to combine a cooking show with a horror movie. We had 3 days of zombie chef's kitchen nightmares before anyone figured out how to reset it. Elora laughed, a sound that seemed to make the observation deck feel warmer somehow. I'm beginning to think the passengers are blaming me for problems that were happening long before I boarded. Beginning to think? You mean you hadn't figured that out from the dancing lobster incident? You heard about that? I was there. Best unintentional entertainment this ship has ever provided. The next morning, Cale made a decision that would either be remembered as heroic or catastrophically stupid. He walked into the main cafeteria during peak breakfast hours, grabbed a tray of what the food synthesizer optimistically labeled scrambled eggs, and sat directly across from Elora at table 47. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A Rigelian diplomat choked on his morning stimulant. Somewhere in the back of the room, a child asked loudly why the nice man was sitting with the scary lady, earning a sharp shush from his mortified parent. Well, Elora said quietly, not looking up from her own breakfast, this should be interesting. I figured it was time to see what all the fuss was about, Cale replied, taking a bite of his eggs. They tasted like rubber mixed with good intentions, but that was standard for ship food. These are terrible, by the way. The eggs or the stairs? Both, though the stairs have better nutritional value. A serving drone approached their table, and for once it functioned properly, dispensing orange juice without spinning in circles or playing ancient lullabies. Elora raised an eyebrow. Remarkable. The machinery seems to work better when there are witnesses around. Amazing how that happens, Kale agreed. It's almost like the problems were never really about you in the first place. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the approach of three passengers Kale recognized from the engineering section. Harold Pittman and his wife Martha, accompanied by a nervous-looking man in a merchant guild uniform. "Excuse me, young man," Martha said, her voice carrying the particular tone that suggested an impending lecture. "But do you think it's wise to encourage this situation?" "Which situation would that be?" Kale asked pleasantly. "The one where I eat breakfast, or the one where I choose my own seating?" "You know what she means," the merchant said, gesturing vaguely at Elora. Strange things happen around her. The environmental systems, the food replicators, even the artificial gravity. Yesterday, my cabin shower started dispensing purple water. "Did you report it to maintenance?" Elora asked. "Well, no, but—" "Because purple water usually indicates mineral buildup in the filtration system," she continued. "It's harmless, but it should be flushed every few weeks. The color comes from trace amounts of copper oxide in the pipes." The merchant stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I used to be an engineer," Elora replied simply. "Before my planet's evacuation, I designed atmospheric recycling systems for deep space stations." Harold leaned forward. "But surely you can understand why people might be concerned about the timing of these malfunctions." "Oh, absolutely," Elora said. "Post hoc ergo propter hoc is a perfectly natural logical fallacy. Though if I were really causing system failures through some mystical alien influence, don't you think I'd start with something more useful than making your shower run purple?" "Like what?" Martha asked, despite herself. "Like making the food replicators produce actual edible meals, for instance. Or fixing the entertainment system so it stops replacing Shakespeare with space pirate adventures." Kale nearly choked on his orange juice. "You'd waste supernatural powers on better food? Have you tasted the protein paste? I'd waste supernatural powers on a decent sandwich." The merchant looked confused. "But if you're not causing the problems, then why? Why are they happening?" Elora finished. "Because this ship is old, understaffed, and running on components that should have been replaced decades ago. The fact that everything works at all is a testament to the dedication of your maintenance crew." She nodded toward Kale. "Ask him. He's the one who actually fixes things around here." All three passengers turned to look at Kale expectantly. He sighed and set down his fork. "She's right. The environmental fluctuations are caused by wear patterns in the atmospheric processors. The food replicator issues stem from corrupted database files that haven't been updated in 3 years. The gravity problems are because we're using backup generators that were designed for emergency use, not continuous operation." "Then why haven't these problems been fixed?" Harold asked. "Because fixing them requires parts we don't have, time we can't spare, and a maintenance budget that exists primarily in the realm of theoretical mathematics," Kale replied. "It's easier to blame mysterious alien influences than admit that we're all traveling through space in what amounts to a very expensive antique." Martha looked skeptical. "But the timing is coincidental," Kale interrupted. "We've been having system failures for months. The only thing that's changed recently is that you've found someone convenient to blame them on. The artificial gravity chose that moment to flicker again, causing everyone's drinks to float momentarily before settling back onto the tables." The three passengers immediately looked at Elora suspiciously. "Right," she said dryly. "Because clearly I waited until this exact moment in our conversation to demonstrate my evil gravity-manipulating powers. It couldn't possibly be related to the fact that we just passed through a gravitational anomaly from that binary star system." "How do you know about the binary system?" the merchant asked. "Because I looked at the navigation charts. They're available to all passengers on the ship's information network." She gestured toward the wall display that showed their current route. "We've been dealing with gravitational interference for the past 2 days. It should clear up once we're past the system's influence in about 6 hours." Kale checked his personal datapad and nodded. "She's right. The navigation logs show multiple gravitational fluctuations as we pass through this region. The three passengers exchanged uncertain glances, their convenient scapegoat theory beginning to crumble under the weight of actual facts. "Well," Martha said finally, "I suppose, that is, maybe we were too quick to assume that the scary alien lady was cursing your plumbing?" Elora suggested helpfully. "It's all right. Fear makes people look for simple explanations to complex problems. It's perfectly natural. Though maybe next time you could try asking the engineering department before jumping to supernatural conclusions," Kale added. "We're usually happy to explain what's actually going wrong with the ship. Sometimes we even know how to fix it." The merchant cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps we owe you an apology, Miss Elora." "An apology accepted, though I'd prefer if you'd spread the word that I'm not actually a mechanical saboteur. It would make meal times considerably more pleasant." As the three passengers retreated, looking somewhat embarrassed, Kale noticed that other conversations in the cafeteria had resumed, though at a noticeably lower volume. Several people were sneaking glances in their direction, but with curiosity rather than hostility. "Well handled," he said quietly. "Engineering knowledge does have its advantages," Elora replied. "Though I have to admit, being blamed for supernatural shower failures was a new experience. Give it time. Tomorrow someone will probably accuse you of making their socks disappear in the laundry. As long as they don't blame me for the smell in the recycling units. That's definitely not supernatural." 3 days later, the celestial drift faced its first genuine crisis in months, and it had nothing to do with alien curses or supernatural shower malfunctions. Kale was halfway through his morning coffee, a beverage that tasted like motor oil mixed with false hope, when the emergency klaxons started blaring throughout the ship. The lights shifted to the ominous red that meant everyone was about to have a very bad day. "All engineering personnel to stations immediately," the ship's AI announced with unusual urgency. "Quantum drive containment breach in progress. This is not a drill, though it might be more entertaining than our usual drills." Even in crisis mode, the AI couldn't help being sarcastic. Kale grabbed his toolkit and rushed toward the engine section, joining a stream of panicked crew members and passengers who clearly had no idea where they were supposed to go during an emergency. The quantum drive chamber was a maze of conduits, monitoring stations, and containment fields that hummed with barely controlled energy. Chief Valdez was standing in front of the main diagnostic panel, looking like a man who just realized his lottery ticket was one number off from the jackpot. "Report," Kale called out as he approached. "Primary containment field is fluctuating," Valdez replied, his voice tight with stress. "The quantum matrix is destabilizing, and if we can't re-establish proper containment, we're looking at a cascade failure that'll leave us stranded in deep space." "What caused it?" "Best guess? That gravitational anomaly from the binary system stressed the containment grid beyond its tolerances. The field generators are 40 years old and held together with spare parts and prayers." Kale studied the readouts, his mind racing through possible solutions. The quantum drive was the heart of their faster-than-light capability. Without it, they'd be stuck in normal space for decades, assuming they didn't all die when the containment field collapsed entirely. "We need to reroute power from the secondary systems and recalibrate the field harmonics," he said finally. "But I'll need someone who understands quantum engineering to help with the calculations." "Good luck finding someone with that expertise on a passenger transport," Valdez muttered. "Actually," came a familiar voice from behind them, "you might be in luck." They turned to see Elora standing at the chamber entrance, her elongated ears slightly perked with interest. She was wearing a maintenance jumpsuit that looked like it had been borrowed from someone considerably shorter. "What are you doing here?" Valdez asked. "This area is restricted to engineering personnel only. I have a degree in quantum mechanics and 15 years of experience with containment field technology," Elora replied calmly. "Also, your security systems are apparently too busy malfunctioning to actually restrict access to anything." Kale looked at her with surprise. "You never mentioned quantum mechanics. You never asked. I assumed former engineer covered it, but I suppose I should have been more specific." She approached the diagnostic panel and began studying the readouts. "Interesting. Your containment matrix is using a modified Heisenberg configuration, but the quantum resonance frequencies are completely wrong for this drive type. Wrong how? Kale asked. They're calibrated for a Mark 7 quantum core, but this ship has a Mark 9. No wonder it's destabilizing. You're essentially trying to contain a hurricane with a butterfly net. Valdez frowned. The specifications show Mark 7 across all systems. The specifications are incorrect, Elora said firmly. Look at the serial numbers on the primary containment assembly. Kale climbed up to the main unit and read off the numbers. Elora nodded grimly. Mark 9, just as I thought. Someone replaced the original drive core during a refit but never updated the software calibrations. Can we fix it? Valdez asked. We can try, Elora replied. But I'll need access to the primary control systems, and we'll have to recalibrate everything manually while the containment field is fluctuating. It's going to be delicate work. And dangerous, Kale added. If we make a mistake. Then we'll have a very brief but spectacular light show, followed by an even briefer period of being scattered across several dimensions, Elora finished cheerfully. But the alternative is definitely being stranded in space, so I'd say the risk-reward ratio favors trying. They worked together for the next 2 hours, Elora's theoretical knowledge combining with Kale's practical experience to slowly stabilize the quantum matrix. The work was painstaking and precise, requiring constant adjustments to compensate for the field fluctuations. Increase the harmonic frequency by 0.03%, Elora called out from her position at the control console. Done, Kale replied from inside the containment assembly. Field strength is holding steady. Excellent. Now we need to realign the quantum phase discriminators. This is the tricky part. If we get the timing wrong, the whole system could collapse. No pressure, Kale muttered. Actually, there's quite a lot of pressure, Elora said seriously. About 15 atmospheres worth, compressed into a quantum singularity and held in place by mathematical equations and good intentions. You're not helping with the stress levels. Sorry. Try thinking of it as a very expensive, very dangerous puzzle. One where all the pieces are made of pure energy and half of them exist in theoretical dimensions. That's actually not more comforting. Despite the danger, they managed to establish a stable containment field just as the ship's AI announced that they were approaching the edge of the gravitational anomaly. The quantum drive hummed back to life, its energy readings returning to normal parameters for the first time in days. Well, Valdez said as they watched the diagnostic displays turn from red to green, I suppose we owe you our thanks, miss. Elora, was it? Just doing my job, she replied. Though technically, I don't think passenger assistance with critical system failures is covered in my ticket agreement. I'll make sure the captain puts a commendation in your file, Valdez promised. And maybe we should update those system specifications while we're at it. As they cleaned up their tools and prepared to leave the engine chamber, Kale found himself walking beside Elora through the corridors that no longer seemed quite so hostile. Word of her role in saving the ship had spread quickly, and passengers who had avoided her for weeks now nodded politely as they passed. So, he said as they reached the main passenger levels, quantum mechanics, atmospheric engineering, and containment field theory. Is there anything you don't know how to fix? The food replicators, apparently, Elora replied with a smile. Though after today, I suspect people might be more willing to overlook the terrible breakfast options. They might even let you sit wherever you want in the cafeteria. Revolutionary concept. Next thing you know, they'll start judging people based on their actions instead of their appearance. They paused at the intersection where their paths would diverge, Kale back to his quarters, Elora to hers. The corridor was busy with normal ship activity, passengers and crew going about their daily routines without the undercurrent of fear and suspicion that had dominated the past few weeks. Thank you, Elora said quietly. Not just for today, but for sitting with me that first time. It meant more than you probably realize. Thank you for not actually being a mechanical saboteur, Kale replied. And for saving all our lives today. Well, someone had to. Besides, being stranded in deep space would have been terrible for my social calendar. As they parted ways, Kale found himself looking forward to tomorrow's breakfast. For the first time since boarding the Celestial Drift, the cafeteria might actually be an interesting place to eat. Even if the food was still terrible, at least the company had improved considerably. Behind him, he could hear Ellora's laughter echoing through the corridor, a sound that had become as familiar and comforting as the ship's quantum engines. Sometimes the best journeys weren't about reaching your destination. They were about discovering that the universe was full of unexpected allies, disguised as strangers with pointy ears and perfectly reasonable explanations for purple shower water. The end.